The first sound is a ping that eats its own echo. In black water beneath the continent, an autonomous submarine inches forward with two beams of light the color of old ice. Somewhere above it, night is a perpetual noon, the Antarctic summer. A sky that refuses to dim, yet down here there is only pressure and the slow huff of the machine's thrusters. The ceiling is not a ceiling, but the belly of a glacier, scalloped and blue, carved into cathedrals by a sea that has learned to burn cold. In the control room of the ship, anchored at the edge of the Amundsen Sea, a pilot rests a fingertip on a joystick without moving it. Every motion here is translated into patience. The Veseran, named by another sea, moves under Thwaites Glacier, a slice of West Antarctica as wide as Florida, a river of ice that meets the ocean and lifts, becoming an ice shelf. Where it lifts is the grounding line, the hinge of a continent. The hinge has been moving. A glaciologist, her hair salted white with spray and the frost of long seasons, leans toward a monitor where streaming numbers jog: temperature, salinity, current speed. The water's not supposed to be this warm, only a degree or two above its freezing point. That is Inuk. Warm circumpolar deep water, a tongue of the Southern Ocean that circles unseen at depth, has been slipping over the continental shelf and rising up troughs cut by ancient ice streams, finding its way to the glacier's underbelly. It doesn't boil it. It erases it. On deck, the air is so clear it sounds like glass. The ship's hull ticks as brash ice bumps along it, little bells ringing the presence of larger things. The ice shelf ahead is a wall, blue stacked on blue, banded with dust of old winds, volcanic ash, Saharan breath, a century of invisible storms. At the break between ice and ocean, the face grunt, a crack the length of a city, pulls itself a little wider and complains in the voice of whales and steel. This place has been a horizon to most. It has been a statistic. Up to 65 centimeters, if Thwaites melts. The counting forward to what a single glacier could do to every shore. Add its neighbors unpinned, and it becomes a different story, a few meters spread out over centuries. Refrain of a phrase that lives in policy papers and lives on islands. The West Antarctic ice sheet. But statistics make poor weather. What they are here to do is look at whether that lasts 1,000 years. What's our distance to the grounding zone? The pilot asks, 200 meters, a voice answers, then corrects itself. 180. Bed topography is rougher than the chart. The ocean floor up here, beneath hundreds of meters of ice and a water column the color of absence, is a memory of past retreats. Ridges run like ribs. There were once the spots where the glacier paused. Rand's sonar paints them as stairs. A ping returns something odd. The ceiling lowers like a wave. The imagery resolves into a Romano column of ice. It doesn't reach the Floran under ice pinnacle, the frozen ghost of a pinning point where the shelf once touched a seafloor bump and found friction. Now it is air in an underwater cathedral, a pillar whose base is lifted away. The glaciologist exhales. We are late, she says. Not to anyone. The glacier's already moving off its old anchors. On land, nothing moves. On ocean, everything does. The wind has been spinning long bands of sea ice out to the west. A Polinia dark window in the ice so opened like a pupil, letting the ship in where in other years it would have been locked out. The sky is a thin glaze. The sun does not set. The engines hum. Beyond the shelf, open ocean heaves up green and cold. The Doomsday Glacier, they call Thwaites, and headlines that need your eyes. The name tastes like cinema when you say it aloud. Cheap and sticky. Back in offices far from this deck, scientists roll their eyes at the nickname and then, later, find themselves using it like a handle when someone in a city they have never seen asks, plain as Rhine, what they should worry about. Worry about this, they think, and the way it speaks to air you cannot touch, carbon knitting the sky thicker. Winds changing direction by half a compass tick, that warm, deep water standing a degree taller. Inside the ship, the pilot and the glaciologist and the watch officer and the electrician with a radio on his shoulder. Listen. The listening machine under the ice flicks its tail and sends a new line of numbers up the fiber. Temperature, negative, but relative warmth. Salinity, what it should be, but stirred. Current, a creep that has learned ambition. The pilot watches a timer that is not labeled as such. Battery estimate. Everything here is an hourglass turned on its side. At the very edge of the shelf, a camera watches the face the way some people watch the faces of the Dayanan. Attempt to see change beginning. The camera catches something not subtle, a slab the size of a sports stadium size, and drops. It falls in pieces, like pages torn from a heavy book. The splash is more sound than sight. Resonant, a drum that shakes your lungs. The berg flips, slowly as a god turning over in sleep, revealing its underside. Green scalloped, luminous. The cathedrals under the ice have had their roof pulled off. The runs. Telemetry stutters. The glaciologist leans in until her nose almost touches the screen. Packet loss. Ice noise, the pilot says. And then the line goes clean again. The submarine threads past another iced column, over a sill, into a valley that points toward the grounding line like a finger. The water is warmer nearer the bottom. Counterintuitive. Unless you grew up where the ocean stratifies with salt and heat like a parfait. The warm water has been sliding up and under, unmaking the glacier where it rests on bedrock shaped like a bowl, tilted the wrong Waha retrograde slope. The retreat of the hinge line here opens more ice to the same kind of water. It is a feedback loop with the grace of a spiral and the malice of a trap. On the other end of the world, a woman in a city with street trees and summer heat runs her hand along the seam where carpet meets baseboard and feels damp on a day that should not be damp. King tide, her neighbor calls from the stoop. The ocean has learned to visit without invitation. A storm that will not make landfall still muscles up a bulge of water and sets it on familiar corners. Miami's pumps hum. Lagos's shoreline eats away, fingernail by fingernail. Dhaka takes on another centimeter, not as an insult, but as a fact. Rotterdam closes gates with the dignity of a bishop. In Jakarta, piles sink, and the land itself subsides. The sea a partner, not the only cause, but the most patient. A shout from the bow. Everyone looks forward. Instinct prevailing over science. A crack runs fine as a hair across a band of blue. It is not where it was yesterday. The ice is rewriting its map. Down below, Rand tilts, swallows the slope, and the ping returns thinner, returns late. Grounding line. The pilot whispers. The place where ice decides whether it is land or sea. The place where warm water presses and licks. Where an ice shelf, esbuttressing its ability to hold back the inland flow, depends on friction with rocks no one will ever see. A cave opens to starboard. The sonar paints a chamber that does not belong to human scale. The battery timer eats a new digit, a fractional drop. But here fractions tie 2 days. The glaciologist watches a small green Detron approach, a jagged gray zonda, unwritten. She rubs her finger over a stain on the console that is coffee and not at all the same color as the ocean here. She has spent 20 years trying to describe to cameras how something can be slow and sudden at once, like the crack in a windshield that only explodes when you hit the pothole. Rand's nose, lights catch something on the ceiling. Terraces, steps in the ice like an empty amphitheater. Melt does not smooth everything. It chews in bites. The bites speak to microturbulence, 2 times when the ocean's breath quickens. A recording device moored back toward the ship will later show Pulse's days when the warm, deep water rides higher, empties itself against ice. The data will be a heartbeat. The person watching it will see a different sound intrudes the ice shelf front flexing in a motion you do not hear as much as feel in your teeth. The ship yawns in her chains. Above the shelf, a new cloud forms where a berg smashed a path. Brine mist blown sideways, like a veil torn and flung. A helideck crewman jumps as the deck shudders, then laughs because the laugh belongs to somebody else's face. The pilot clears his throat. We need to turn her. He watches a thin fiber optic tether draw a line in his mind. He knows that when Rand turns, that tether will describe a curve in waters filled with knife edges of ice. He knows that the place they left will not be the place they return to. He does it anyway. The ship creaks. A second crack. Not the hairline one, but something older, longer, sized toward their planned pickup hole, as if to meet it. That ping that eats its echo comes slower. The battery timer drops by 1 more tone. The line on the plotter becomes an arrow that points at something which was also moving, toward a door that might not be where they left it. Ranus' autopilot nudges her along a path the team has threaded only in models through a canyon of pale green, under a bridge of ice so thin light knits through it in green stitches, across a floor littered with rocks dropped by the glacier when it thought it could afford to let go. The rocks look like the thoughts of mountains, rounded, wandering, not at home here. Proof of a past where ice reached farther and thought itself permanent. At the surface, winds rake the Polinia with a cold so dry it turns breath to powder. The ship's radar shows bands of pack ice turning like the slowest carousel. The plan to pick up point an opening in the sea ice with a ladder of aluminum hung down slides a few meters under the push of physics. The helideck crew ties down a helicopter that hasn't flown yet. The pilot's thumb leaves a white moon where it presses the joystick. "Hold me on the wire," he tells the glaciologist. "Half a metaphor, half literal. The fiber is all of them. Numbers, then images, then numbers squared." The camera in Ranus' nose shows a seafloor that has been polished by the glacier's belly, cut by grooves that match, fatally and exactly, the orientation of troughs that lead from the shelf break inland. The instrument suite measures salinity, temperature, oxygen. The compute stack turns measurements into maps. The maps are running. They show the pathways that warm water uses to climb, to arrive, to press up against ice that is grounded inland on bedrock that slopes downward. The wrong type of slope. Retrograde. If the glacier withdraws from its first foothold, it exposes a thicker column of ice to that warm water. The process feeds itself. Not a cliff falling. A string pulled from a sweater. A wave of small focus arrives on deck. Satellite flyovers pinch their data through an orbit and down to the ship's terminals. An interferometric parry is set now one. This pass and last pulls a magic trick with microwaves. Two looks turned into a map of motion. Fringes like a fingerprint pressed over Thwaites. The grounding line has jagged its way inland faster in patches than they had guessed. The rate has quickened in places by hundreds of meters a year since the late 1990s. Those are the years they can see. Ridges. On the seafloor, the ones Ran is reading like braille tell of a pulse in the last centuries when the grounding line stepped backward as if pushed. 2 kilometers in a year. Then paused, then stepped again. The glacier remembers faster retreats than this. The thought chills in a way the air cannot. A memory surfaces among the team like something dropped on purpose. The NASA flight that found a hidden hollow. A cavity under the ice shelf 2/3. The area of Manhattan and 300 meters tall. A mouth chewing out Thwaites from below. It contained 12 billion tons of ice erased in 3 years. A labeled picture went around the planet. A hole as big as an anger. The hole was not a hole forever. It was a symptom. A window into the undershelf sea where the real work was happening. They made this collaboration the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration B, 'cause no one nation could go after a hinge this big alone. Hot water drilling rigs rowed south on other ships. A borehole program would thread a hose the width of a small tree through 600 meters of ice, steam meeting ocean with a hiss, through the hole that lower sensors and ridiculous and exactly right. A slender robot with a camera and a curiosity. Ice fin. A submarine for a boat. They will call its footage terraces and peanut brittle, because language reaches for metaphors when physics pushes past the edges of what you can say. Without poetry, they will call a network of cracks a windshield and mean that a shatter can proceed quickly once it finds its pattern. Run noses up the ceiling lowers. The pilot adjusts depth by a breath, and the submarine skims under a lip of ice that turns his screen green. The fiber groans. In some register no one hears. The glaciologist looks at the little drawing that shows the ship as a triangle, and the submarine as a dot. The dot must find the triangle's shadow. Elsewhere, the sea bends to the moon, and spills itself over a walkway in a coastal town whose name you know. The locals have learned how to lift their feet just so, how to hold groceries high, how to move their lives back a step without admitting it is retreat. Venice raises steel gates and calls it engineering. Norfolk raises roads. Kinshasa listens to rain and to rivers, and to a sea that moves even when the wind is inland. In Tetames, The barrier that looks like a string of silver beetles hunches its back and stops the surge. And still, every year, the sea invests more centimeters into the future's tide. Thwaites is a long way from all of them. That is a preposition without meaning. The ocean connects like wire. On the radio, the mooring team calls from the stern. They sent a pop to a release box bolted to the seafloor last season. The plan being that when it heard the code, it would spit up a string of instruments, hundreds of meters long, floats and temperature loggers, and current meters clipped to it like ornaments on a spine. The ocean sometimes decides to keep what you offer it. Today, the metal release heard, obeyed, hummed, and then the string did not rise. The team stares into tinted water where the Palinja has cooled, listens for a buoy to ding. The boss ties on a hard hat he already wore and leans over the stern and says, "To no one." Come on. The iceberg that fell earlier rolls again. A deep green waves rises with it and runs away. It carries small ice, brash and grease, and sliding slabs like trays. The helideck crew secures the chocks. A man with a headset drinks coffee that tastes like metal cup. The watch officer runs a hand along a railing that has been hand-smoothed by other winters. The deck shakes. The shell face, elsewise still, sends a low boom that arrives later than you thought it should. Sound here travels any way it wants. The pilot mutters a word that is not in the manual. Rand's compass drifts in the seafloor. Not enough to make trouble except where the world is already fragile. The pilot trims thrusters to compensate and watches numbers trickle down a tube in a corner of his screen. Battery percent. No one says the number out loud. It keeps everyone company anyway. Back home in conference rooms, with carpet that grips shoes and slides, decks there are slides about, marine ice sheet instability. Missy. The idea that glacial retreat on a sloping bed below sea level can be more recently other slides have offered marine ice cliff instability. Missy. A vision of unbuttressed tall cliffs collapsing under their own weight, dominoes without friction. This second one is argued over like a family heirloom. Is it real? Did it apply then? Will it here? They are not here to settle arguments. They're here to bring back facts. The fiber line vibrates in quiet, some little crackle compounded by ship as own a noise end. Then relaxes as prop wash clears. A faint current feathers through Rand sensors. From deep up toward shallow, meaning warm water continues to push. The pilot looks at the clock. The glaciologist looks past the clock. Tisha booms. The ocean breathes. One slow, long breath. The mooring team's shout cuts the air. The string has risen. Orange floats appear, like planets surfacing one, then another, a little offset, bang against the hull. The team snagging lines with poles that look toothpick thin against ocean and ice. First onto deck is a CTD logger scabbed with a year of marine growth, hair-like, brown-green. The engineer grins dirt into the white of his beard and says, "Oh, you beautiful thing," to a cylinder of plastic and steel. They will download it and see pulses in the temperature record days, when heat came higher, stronger, like the hand of a thing tapping the underside of the ice shelf. The pulses match, not perfectly, with winds on the shelf break. A door opens and closes. The breath is shifting. There is a clatter in the control room that is small and somehow louder than all the booms. A wrench falls, rolls, stops against a boot. The pilot lifts his thumb. I've got her clear of the sills. The nose camera shows a roof that rises. The sonar, once choked, opens. The ship's triangle on the plot looks closer than a minute before. The green point moves in little stutters toward it. On deck, a crack in the sea ice that had been a line thin as eyelash flexes. The crack runs, shoulder quick, toward the place where a ladder has been lowered. The air tastes like an old penny, cold iron. The crew is already hauling the ladder, throwing roped buoys, moving like people do when they know a walk path is about to close. The pilot eyes flicking between the camera and the numbers, counts seconds. Batteries, like lungs, are clocks. The dot nears the triangle. The triangle shifts. The ladder skates 3 feet to port and then 10 more. A head pops out from below the ice like a seal's. Not Rand's, but a phantom of fear. Someone laughs, then stops. The pilot turns the submarine's nose upslope, then flattens, then cuts thrusters entirely, and lets the leftover motion carry. He breathes out a meter of air he did not know he was holding. The glaciologist reaches for the intercom and says, "Stand by on the winch. She's coming in." The boom goes again, closer now, and the surface buckles in a long, slow rise. Water lifting ice, ice lifting ladders. For one moment the hole in the ice where they intend to retrieve their robot is not a hole but a promise breaking. Then, a rim collapses. A ring of brash floods in. Little white cubes, clinking glassily against the aluminum ladder. The fiber line tightens. The winch winds. The pilot feeds in a fraction of thrust. Rand's camera shows a shaft of green light above and a tinsel of ice below. And then, with the oddest grace, the submarine noses air. Hands that have been hauling rope all summer grab the line and a sleek orange back breaks into whirled. Glossy with cold, it thumps onto deck, and the ship absorbs the impact like a mother. There is laughter. It sounds like surprise. The pilot unclenches his thumb, and it leaves a crescent on the stick. He stands, and his knees forget their stiffness. The glaciologist lays her palm on Rand's skin. It is not warm and not cold. A kind of just what. "Welcome back," someone says to a machine. The year becomes a string of rooms with no roofs. A drilling team 40 miles away spools out a hose with steam coiling from its flange. The hot water jet beginning its patient dig. The operator holds the nozzle as if aiming a fire at a sky you cannot see. The spray disappears into a pinhole in the ice and returns nowhere. 6 hours later, the hole widens enough to breathe, then becomes a chimney breathing steam. They lower down a camera the size of a pigeon. The screen fills with blue. A foot of ice seen from inside looks old and new all at once. Layers like tree rings, brine channels fine as veins. The camera slides across the interface and into sea. The world turns upside down. The ceiling has roughness like language. Icefin follows, longer, rigged with lasers that paint dots across ice to measure the size of its scars. The video it brings back is a science film that one teen-need narration. A roof stepped into terraces, ledges a few feet high, stair-stepped, carved by eddies of warm water. What the ocean does with the heat we give it is not uniform. It is an artiste, not a factory. One ledge glows greener melt, fresher exposure, the ocean's mouth at this very moment open. At the surface, the team squints into the endless noon. They describe cracks in the ice shelf, with metaphors borrowed from human fragility windshields. Peanut brittle because the geometry looks more like candy and glass than something you should call a continent. The Thwaites eastern ice shelf is a buttress pinned by a few stubborn knuckles of rock. Those pins, on the mapped shoals, have been losing their purchase. A shear zone to the north is opening, stitches popping. In briefings, a scientist who has watched it more closely than her own handwriting will say, carefully, within 5 years, this part of the shelf could fail. Could, not, will. 5 years is a kind of thunderclap when measured against ice time. In the ship's lab, a young researcher in a hat with ear flaps downloads the mooring data and watches the ribbon of temperature trace go up and down, faintly like breathing out longer than in. Each peak the mooring recorded was a day when the deep current leaned forward. The peaks cluster in a time when wind at the shelf break did the same. Months later, he will show a plot and use the phrase pathways for heat. Someone will ask if we could turn the pathway off. Out here, the wind answers that question the way wind does. By lifting spindrift off a ridge and flinging it into a parabolic arc with aesthetic abandon, a satellite called Isesatu sweeps a green laser across the ice from 500 kilometers up. Counting photon returns the way tide counts seconds, mapping the surface 2 centimeters. Slight lowers appear where you would not like them. Cups punched into the shelf above channels, signs of thinning from below. Cryosatus. Radar altimeter adds its overlain humps and hollows. In combination, the satellites tell you a story of a surface remade from the bottom. You cannot touch the under-ice sea, but you can trace its thumbprint. It is a season of precision and of things that refuse it. A storm backs around, the wind opposite to what it was yesterday, and the sea changes its mind about what the ship should do. The ice shelf front does what ice shelves do when their mass no longer matches their elevation. A piece goes that is big enough to earn a name in a different sea. Here, it is just an adjustment, the edge finding its own. The ship moves into open water with a slowness born of steel's long experience with ice. Helicopters fly a box of bolts and one of donuts to the drilling camp across pressure ridges that look like a frozen skein of rope. In a plywood hut with a flag faded by light that will not quit, an old Antarctic hand sits on a bunk and rubs his knees while a kettle sings. When I came here in '88, he says to the graduate student fiddling with a fiber connector, we thought the issue was the Ross and the Weddell, big shelves, cold sands drama. This side, he gestures vaguely toward a compass point that in this hut has only ceremonial meaning. This side was quiet. The Amundsen Sea. Now it's where the action is. The student asks, what changed? He looks at her over the rim of the cup. We did, he says, then nods toward the weather that is not weather but climate, a planet that keeps the books. Outside, a gull the size of the student's forearm south. Polar squatches. Everything with yellow eyes, smart with theft. It waits for a lapse in attention. Finds one. Steals a biscuit. Jewelry and food taste the same to a skua. It flaps off, offended anyway by being observed. The team deploys a cluster of GPS receivers onto the ice shelf, each a biscuit-colored dome on a little tripod. The data they spit back home through a satellite S. Velvet string will show the ice shelf S surface heaving with tides, rising and falling a meter. 2, here and there anchored, here and there free. In the uplands, kilometers inland, other teams drill poles into blue ice. Those poles will fall downstream like crumbs. Everything moves here. The question is how fast, and how much faster, soon. Pine Island Glacier Thwaites' neighbor has been scolding from Benito, calves regular armadas of its own. Both drain an interior bowl of ice seated below sea level. The maps of that bowl show depth of a kilometer or more where rock should have been a break and is instead a funnel. You can see the shape, but you can feel its appetite in numbers. How many cubic kilometers per year this much ice makes? If each cube is thought like a city, how many cities poured into an ocean that does not refuse? Through the ship's windows, the line that is the horizon plays a trick. The ice shelf in the far distance seems to lean in. It is just perspective, or not. The words unstable and irreversible have been used on stages by careful people who sign their names to both. They travel down airwaves and settle in ears that have other things to do. Kids to fetch. Bills to pay. A storm to board up against on a coast. Twice around the world. In a room, in a city, built from water and effort. A planner, here's the word century and writes. Decade. You cannot build a seawall for 2100 with a budget that lasts until the next election. But you can change the height of a curb. You can ban basements in new construction. You can buy out houses on a block and plant trees and let water stand there when it needs to. You can put hospitals on high ground. You can argue for a levy and lose, and argue again. The planner scrolls past an article with a phrase, in quotes, Doomsday Glacier, and sighs. The nickname is a hook. A hook is not a harbor. She saves a diagram anyway. Back on the ice shelf, the drilling crew hears a sound that makes conversation stop without anyone noticing it stopped. The sound is distance closing. They step outside the hut and look toward the front, which is a line of ragged blue cut teeth. A crack runs from the horizon to a nearby pressure ridge and stops as politely as a pen line at the edge of a margin. They watch it do nothing. Then it does something. It widens at a point you cannot see the reason for. If you could see beneath, you would watch pins letting go. If you could see it all, you would never stop looking. A helicopter lifts with 2 souls aboard and bathes the crack's far lip in rotor wash. It doesn't fall then. It will later. The pilot looks down and cuts a tidy arc and heads back to the ship. That nitor, what passas for an ito, wind shifts back. The swell lifts onto the front. A piece goes that includes a corner they had walked on yesterday. Instability is slow until it is quick. They are far enough. They are not far at all. They coil the hose, pull up the GPS tripods, pull in the mooring lines. The ship points its bow into a sea that has put down its roadblocks for the day. The problem they came to touch has not grown smaller for being touched. The data they carry is heavy. It will ask for new sentences in rooms with microphones and in homes with thresholds. People are starting to notice their parents didn't sandbag into pilot's room. Run is cradled in padding. It scratches redding like a The pilot runs his fingers over them, and in the bright light of a sun that is a clock that has given up on hours, feels time hurry. Feels it thicken with a pressure that has nothing to do with depth. They are back the next season, because seasons are the way the planet speaks in time. The Palinha opens again, but grudgingly. The pack ice is a tilted chessboard of floes, crushed in on themselves, a topography of white. The ship muscles through. Birds perch on moving burgee bits, like commuters snagging a ride. The coastline is still a line, but it is a different line. Satellite mosaics put the old and the new side by side, and the human eye cannot help but notice absence. A bay the shape of a bite has grown deeper. A rift others had traced like a question mark has acquired a dot. They work long because you do not waste weather. The under-ice currents are measured again. The moorings redeployed have small barnacles already colonizing before they are out of sight. Icefin is lowered down a new hole that melted for the first time in recorded time last year. Its camera peers into a cave and catches snow raining upward. Frasal crystals forming in supercooled eddies sub-zero, whether that exists only under ice. The precision of that word, supercooled, hides how strange it feels to the mind. On the east side of Thwaites, a lacework of cracks has advanced like a spilled drink. A notch has worked its way back toward a buttress that matters. If the eastern ice shelf were to shatter, the inland flow of the glacier could speed like a river losing a dam. The numbers from the GPS receivers, their daily signs and cosines that tides up and down, have begun to acquire a forward trend. The way a treadmill always takes you somewhere, even if your feet say you are in place. The analogies feel cheap in the mouth, and still you reach for them, because the thing itself is too big to say. Perfect. They take a helicopter inland on a day that looks like a promise and grows teeth. The pilot bucks the machine through a line of sastrugi the snow frozen waves and sets down by a row of bamboo flags marking where the crust will not hold. They dig a pit not because this is the project, but because it is what you do to know a place. The layers are labeled by winter, distinct blankets of blue, fine silt lines, where a storm brought in something foreign. The grad student pulls a sample and baggies it, her handwriting trembling, not from nerves, but from cold. The scientist running the pit smiles into her muffler. The ice remembers everything, she says, and thinks of what else remembers. Back north, runs of days, aligned with high tides. On far coasts, cameras mounted on lampposts catch water walking itself up to thresholds without a storm to chaperone. Sunny day flooding, a phrase old men on dock say with a shrug that is practice and not ease. The rates make lines you can put on axes. 3 millimeters a year here. For there, the sum plus thermal expansion, plus Greenland's own slide, plus the pump of subsiding ground where aquifers are emptied to stand tall towers on. Jakarta announces it will move its capital to a higher island because it must. In Louisiana, a tribe votes to move their town from a disappearing marsh to a place with street names no one knows yet. In the Netherlands, a child bikes to school along a dike older than her grandparents and does not think of it as a wall. Back on Thwaites, a slab of ice, you could map a neighborhood onto tips and goes. The ship rocks. The pilot puts a palm against a bulkhead and feels cold steel, as if it were a thought. The mooring team brings up a string that, miraculously, this time returns with all its pieces. The temperature data shows the pulses of warm water again. The same heartbeat, but slower. Then faster seasons inside seasons. Winds and eddies shifting the points where the deep rises. When the wind blows from the west long enough in winter, the clockwork flips. Warm intrusions land like planes on a runway. Their models have names, too. Midgame, with its grids. ROMS with its parameterizations. PISM humming iceflow numbers into the future. With all the caveats you can layer on to time, they run scenarios with atmospheres that slow their warming, and ones that do not. They end with maps of sea level contribution measured in centimeters and meter fractions. And maps colored where people live most densely now. You can imagine the basements filling. You can imagine the salty born into streets where salt was once something you kept in a kitchen jar. A cabin conversation takes place between two worlds. A sea captain who speaks in wave height, and a scientist who speaks in standard deviations. So, the captain says, gesturing with his mug at a sea the color of steel, when I retire and go fish a place where the bar's not this dangerous, tell me true will I see this thing go. He means the big thing, the myth, the headliner, cliff face letting go, a glacier, sprinting. The scientist looks past him to the horizon, which, like all horizons, is not straight in the way the heart likes. You'll see more blue water, she says carefully. You will see more ice on the sea than came from the sky. You will think, more often, that the ice edge is farther than it used to be. But the main thing is that your grandchildren will talk about what we did or didn't do now. Somewhere far off, a parliament votes. Somewhere else, a minister shrugs. In a city under normal sky, a teacher in a science class shows a cartoon of a glacier on a retrograde bed and a hand goes up and the student asks, bright-voiced, so if it's inevitable, why try? And the teacher says, too quickly, it's not inevitable. And then slows and says, more true. The end is not a point. It is a range. The slope can be eased. Timing is everything when you build cities. The ship takes one last shot at a transect along the shelf front. The sea ice is calmed. The front in this sector is studied with old rifts, now joined up into a geometry the map respects. They drop a profiler. It rides a winch cable through the surface skin into a water column salted with melt, freshening at the surface in a vein, heavy, a depth. The data is familiar and not. There's a pulse of warmth at 200 meters that wasn't there last year, a lens of heat squatting where a pin once bit. The glaciologist runs a finger along the plot. Patient. That's new, she says. That's a door opening the wrong way. The door is a metaphor for wind, which is turned by degrees, and for currents, which are found new. Geostrophic balance along the shelf break because the atmosphere you cannot see has been leaning down on a circle of ocean the size of a planet for years. You try to make it simple. You end with describing a hinge on a house the size of all our houses. A band of cloud drops an edge, blankets the Polinia, and sets a fine snow sifting down. Snow on sea absorbs noise so well you hear yourself think. The deck crew coils lines and then uncoils them because it is bad luck to finish early. The pilot looks at Ran and counts breaths, an old superstitious sailor's trick at the ends of things. The crack that had been a line is now a shape. The helicopter is tied down. The ship's engines already mutter their readiness and their reluctance. They could leave, they could stay. The window is a shoulder width wide. The science says stay. The ocean says pick or be picked. They pick. The mooring comes aboard heavy with the year, glistening. The last profiler climbs into winter with a lag. The crack's edge shudders and slides 2 meters inland with a delicate crackle, as if sugar glazing is breaking. The ship's horn speaks, deep and kind. The pilot flips a cover over the joystick and it clicks like a promise you'd better keep. And in that click is the way endings become beginnings, even here, where the planet seems to keep its own counsel. They make it out through the Polinia's front door before the lock changes. The ship noses past the ice shelf edge and into the swell where their care becomes the ocean's job. Behind, a section of the front gives a last shrug and lets a yard of blue slide into green. A skewer rides the updraft off the ship's stack and calls a single insult that reads, simply, human. In the lab, the first look always deceptive. Always a thrill says what they half knew in their bones going south. The warm intrusions have a rhythm. The under-ice terraces mean melt is rough and fast in places, and sleepy in others. The grounding line is stepping back, where the bed slopes downward. The pins that keep the eastern ice shelf braced are fraying. The data will become papers with author lists that look like family trees. They will speak in terms as spare as winter. We find, we observe, implies, concurs. But around and under the spare, they will feel the urgency that belongs to firemen and midwives. Back in the north of the world, the story arrives and then recedes, and then, on a day with no news, arrives again. Doomsday Glacier, says a Chiron, with its clip of ice falling into surf. Someone looks up from lunch and feels a quiver of awe, and then the meeting after lunch is about packing. Shallow water creeps up under a boardwalk in Florida. An old man in the Sundarbans sits back on his haunches and watches the river he knows become a different river. A family in the Pacific draws a measure on their housepost to show a child where the king tide came to last year and this. A city planner adds 10 centimeters to a design and size. It is not nothing, it is asta. It is not enough alone. Nothing is alone. In a dim meeting room where the carpet is a wave pattern chosen by a person who never went to see a scientist, with dry lips stands before a slide that shows the West Antarctic ice sheet as a bowl with holes in its rim. She puts her laser pointer on Thwaites and says the numbers that carry mass and time. If Thwaites were to give up all it holds, add 60 centimeters to every coastline. If its retreat drags other basins, a few meters. Over centuries, not next week, but contributions in decades measure in inches and feet where you stand on a threshold. We are not bystanders, she says. Ice listens to wind. Wind listens to heat. The heat in the ocean is a ledger you can help balance. A member of the audience raises a hand. Even if we cut emissions now. The scientist nods, a small nod whose thousands of hours speak for it. We have baked in change, she says, but we have not baked in the worst. Every ton withheld is less ocean heat. Every fraction of a degree slows winds shifting. Every 1/10 of a meter at the shoreline is a different future for a block, a school of family. She does not say, the glacier cares about physics, not politics. She does not need to. Everyone in the room knows physics will be the better politician in any long run. In Antarctica the next season, the ice does what ice does. Shifts, calls, calves, sleeps looking like stillness, and moving all the while. The GPS domes report tide and time, and then one day their signals go flat because the shelf under them has become sea. The moorings speak in a language of numbers from a place no camera lives. Satellites flash their green and their radar and build. Over years, the biography of a Hinjan retreat. The terraces under the ice are carved and then recarved. The under-ice river learns new banks. In far harbors, people act anyway. A reef restoration team plants corals because a reef breaks waves, and it is a bank account for wave energy as much as a beauty. In Rotterdam, gates rise. In Boston, a plan for a park that floods on purpose clears a vote. In Norfolk, a church higher on the slope hosts a congregation from the low ground, with a matter-of-fact kindness that feels like air. In Lagos, a boy ties a boat in a way his father taught him and his father before, and the knot holds. In Kiribati, a woman tells her daughter that the sea is not an enemy and not a friend. It is the sea. And she points to a drawing of a house on stilts and says, "We will land." The International Thwaites Glacier collaboration wraps a field season. The cranes lift crates. The ship has swag pencils a white line on a deep blue no one owns, and everyone does. On T-Bridge, the captain takes a picture of a horizon he will not keep. In the hold, a black case looks ordinary. The glaciologist sits on it for a minute and closes her eyes. In Tatkiat, she hears again the sound of a machine's ping under ice, the way it eats itself returning. The way it sounds like a question and an answer both. Years from now, a child will stand at a waterfront in a city whose name she spells carefully and watch. At a keen tide as water touches a mark on a step and makes of a line a mirror. In that mirror she sees sky and gull and her own face, brief, then rippled. Behind her, in a museum, there will be a piece of ice in a case, melting into a pan with a polite drain. A plaque will say West Antarctica, Thwaites Glacier, collected by people who knew they were picking up the planet with both hands and trying not to drop it. The sea will grow, not as a monster, but as a story being written in centimeters and meters, informed by places most of us will never go and machines that hum under ceilings you could not walk beneath. The glacier will go on moving, which is what glaciers do. The difference will lie in how fast, which is what we have to do with. On a last day, aboard, the pilot of Rand takes the joystick out of its bracket and wraps it in foam for the transit north. It is a small gesture, knowing where the fragile parts are. On deck, the crew stands in a wind that smells like clean iron and watches the ice shelf turn into a thin blue band behind them, then into a thought. The glaciologist pulls the ceramic mug she stole from an earlier ship out of her jacket pocket and sips coffee that is too hot and too bitter and perfect. The horizon is what it always has been. A lie that is mostly true. The ship noses along a curve, the maps coal straight. The ocean, huge and personal, receives. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that changed the world.